The year is 2025. A global food crisis grips the planet. Millions are on the brink of starvation. The warning signs have long been apparent. Now the consequences are impossible to ignore. The World Food Programme estimates that 343 million people face severe food insecurity. This is a staggering number. It's a humanitarian crisis of immense proportions. East Africa is particularly vulnerable. Over 61 million people in the region are food insecure. Western and Central Africa face a similarly dire situation. Nearly 50 million people in these regions are projected to face acute hunger. These numbers are not just statistics. They represent real people. Families, children, entire communities struggling to survive. This crisis is not confined to developing nations. The United Kingdom, once a beacon of food security, now faces its own vulnerabilities. The UK's food system, described as outdated and vulnerable, is ill-equipped to deal with the converging crises. A lack of coherent post-Brexit food policy has exposed deep cracks in the nation's food infrastructure. The situation is dire. The question is not whether we are facing a food crisis, but whether we are prepared to act before it escalates into a full-blown catastrophe. The time for complacency is long gone. The time for action is now. The current food crisis is not a sudden shock. It is the culmination of interconnected crises. Years of conflict, economic instability, and climate change have eroded global food systems. These factors have converged to create a perfect storm. This storm threatens to plunge millions into deeper poverty and hunger. Conflict is a key driver of food insecurity. Wars in Ukraine, Sudan, and other regions have disrupted agricultural production. These conflicts have also displaced millions, forcing them to flee their homes and livelihoods. The war in Ukraine, in particular, has sent shockwaves through global grain markets. Ukraine, once known as the breadbasket of Europe, is now struggling to feed itself, let alone export its surplus. Economic instability further exacerbates the situation. Rising inflation, driven in part by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine, has made food unaffordable for millions. The rising cost of living has pushed many families into a desperate struggle for survival. They are forced to make impossible choices between food, shelter, and other necessities. Climate change adds another layer of complexity to the crisis. Extreme weather events such as droughts, floods, and heat waves are becoming more frequent and intense. These events devastate crops and livestock, leading to reduced agricultural yields and food shortages. The impact of climate change is felt most acutely by those who are least equipped to adapt: smallholder farmers and vulnerable communities in developing countries. As the need for food assistance reaches unprecedented levels, the World Food Programme, the leading organisation fighting hunger globally, faces a crippling funding crisis. In 2025, the WFP has experienced a 40% drop in funding compared to the previous year. This drastic reduction has forced the organisation to make agonising choices. The consequences are dire. The WFP has been forced to cut back on vital food assistance programmes. This has left millions of people without a lifeline. The organisation is now facing the grim reality of having to prioritise aid. This means that some of the most vulnerable populations will receive less assistance than they desperately need. Adding to the crisis are ongoing trade disruptions. The war in Ukraine has exposed the fragility of global supply chains. Export bans and limitations on essential food items, such as wheat and fertilizers, have further tightened global food supplies and driven up prices. These actions, while perhaps intended to protect domestic markets, have had a ripple effect. They have exacerbated food insecurity in import-dependent countries. The global community is failing to respond adequately to this crisis. The lack of funding for the WFP and the continuation of trade-distorting measures are short-sighted and dangerous. These actions threaten to undermine global efforts to combat hunger and could lead to widespread famine and suffering. Tariffs on essential goods have also played a significant role in trade disruptions. These tariffs have increased the cost of importing critical food supplies, further straining the global food system. The impact is felt most acutely in countries that rely heavily on imports to feed their populations. The clock is ticking. We are facing a global food emergency of unprecedented scale. The time for half measures and empty promises is over. We need immediate, coordinated and sustained action to avert a humanitarian disaster. First and foremost, we must fully fund the World Food Programme. This is not charity, it is an investment in global stability and security. World leaders must step up and ensure that the WFP has the resources it needs to fulfill its mandate. Failure to do so will have catastrophic consequences for millions of people around the world. We must also work to resolve conflicts, address economic instability, and tackle climate change. These are the root causes of food insecurity. We cannot address hunger without addressing these underlying issues. This requires a paradigm shift from reactive, short-term solutions to long-term, sustainable solutions that address the systemic problems at the heart of the crisis. Increased domestic production in food-insecure regions is essential. This requires investment in sustainable agriculture, climate-resilient farming practices, and rural development. Empowering local farmers and strengthening local food systems will build resilience and reduce dependence on imports. Finally, we must prioritize global cooperation and solidarity. The food crisis is a global problem that requires a global solution. We must reject protectionist policies that restrict trade and exacerbate food shortages. Instead, we must work together to build a more just and equitable global food system, a system that ensures that everyone has access to safe, nutritious, and affordable food. The situation is dire, but it is not hopeless. We can still avert the worst of this crisis, but we must act now. The lives of millions of people depend on it.